revolutionary and a general, a great modernizer and a ruthless tyrant, Joseph Stalin could claim to be them all. One of the most influential figures of the 20th century, he would rise from humble beginnings to become the leader of the Soviet Union, one of the world's largest superpowers, being unafraid to sacrifice anything or anyone to achieve power. His political opponents would be shot, his own citizens would be hunted down by the secret police, and millions would be sentenced to backbreaking work in the Gulag labour camps. This is the story of Joseph Stalin. Joseph Jugashvili, later to be known as Joseph Stalin, was born on December 6, 1878, in the small Georgian town of Gori, on the outskirts of the Russian Empire. His mother was a skilled dressmaker, and his father was a successful cobbler, with the boy experiencing a comfortable upbringing. But it was not to last. His father would turn to drink and began beating him, eventually abandoning the family entirely. Wanting the best for her son, Stalin's mother would send him off to a theological school, where she hoped he could climb the social hierarchy by becoming a priest. Stalin was a model student, known for his hard work and his singing in the church choir. But as he entered his late teenage years, he would become disillusioned with religious life. During his third year at the seminary, he would join an illegal book club, becoming inspired by the stories of the fictional Georgian hero Koba, a name he would later use as his own during his early years as a revolutionary. He would also be highly influenced by the works of Karl Marx and his theories known as Marxism, one of the most popular forms of socialism at the time. Stalin would soon develop an interest in politics and would become involved with a group of Social Democrats, a revolutionary socialist party who aimed to overthrow the Russian monarchy. As Stalin's involvement in revolutionary politics continued to grow, his grades and reputation at the seminary would begin to decline, with him being expelled in 1899 after failing to attend his daily prayers and being found in the possession of illegal literature. At the age of 22, following a wave of harsh crackdowns by the authorities, Stalin would leave his old life behind and go into hiding, becoming a full-time revolutionary. Despite his young age, he would be described by his colleagues as exceptionally vicious and vindictive, willing to apply the most extreme measures in his attempts to dominate the party, with him soon rising to the top of the local revolutionary leadership. Stalin would soon find himself drawn to the teachings of Vladimir Lenin, the leader of a socialist faction known as the Bolsheviks, who followed a more radical and militant course of action. Stalin would quickly become a leading Bolshevik in Georgia and the surrounding area, and while living with a colleague, he would meet his first wife, Yekaterina Svanitsa, with the couple marrying in 1906. Less than a year later, Stalin's first son, Yakov, would be born. But the dangerous life of a revolutionary did not mix well with family. After travelling to the city of Baku with her husband, Yekaterina would fall seriously ill, dying in November 1907. Her death would have a profound effect on Stalin, and at the funeral he would state, "This creature softened my heart of stone. She died, and with her died my last warm feelings for humanity." Unable to deal with his grief, Stalin would abandon his 8-month-old son Yakov to be raised by his mother's family, not returning to see him for several years. As the years went on, Stalin would rise through the ranks of the Bolsheviks, becoming known for his ruthless methods, raising money through armed robberies, protection rackets and ransoms. In 1912, he would adopt the name Stalin, meaning man of steel. But Stalin's newfound fame would also make him a high-priority target for the police. In 1913, he would be caught and sentenced to 4 years of exile in Siberia, an inhospitable region of eastern Russia. It would be one of Stalin's lowest points. During this period, he suffered with poor health and became increasingly depressed in his isolation, with the 35-year-old seeking companionship with a local 14-year-old girl, with it being rumoured the two had a child together. He would slowly stop producing revolutionary works, and in 1915, Lenin would famously forget his last name. For Stalin, it appeared the revolutionary dream was over. In 1917, while still in exile, Stalin would receive the news that he had been working towards for over 15 years. Revolution had taken place in Russia. Russia's population, over 100 million people, had suffered years of oppression, discontent and poverty. Coupled with the horrendous failures of the First World War and the personal failings of Russia's monarch, Tsar Nicholas II would be executed, ending 300 years of his family's rule, with a provisional government being established to take control of the country. Stalin was soon released from his exile and made his way back to central Russia with a renewed sense of purpose. But his mentor Lenin was still unsatisfied, calling for yet another revolution that would see a socialist government take power. However, there was significant resistance within the party towards his ideas, with Stalin openly expressing his opposition. To get Stalin on his side, Lenin would give him a place on the Bolshevik Central Committee, granting him a large amount of influence and his first real taste of power. Stalin would quickly devote himself to Lenin's cause, and that October, the Bolsheviks would stage a second revolution, removing the provisional government from power and establishing themselves as leaders of the country. As a leading Bolshevik, Stalin was now one of the most powerful men in the country. But the struggle was not finished. The revolution would lead to 5 years of civil war, an exceptionally brutal period that would shape Stalin into the cruel and ruthless leader he would later become. During the civil war, he would be appointed to the city of Tsaritsyn by Lenin to acquire grain for the Bolsheviks and to organize the local fighting forces. But lacking any military knowledge or experience, Stalin would completely mishandle the situation, and after just 2 months under his command, the city was on the verge of collapse, with many soldiers having died under his command. Faced with this disaster, Stalin would turn to a technique that would later become a staple of his political career. He would begin the use of terror. The disaster was soon blamed on counter-revolutionaries, spies and saboteurs, who were arrested, convicted on weak or fabricated evidence, and then executed. Stalin became known for being particularly brutal in his use of terror, burning down entire villages and arresting anyone who dared to argue with him. He was highly suspicious of military personnel, who he would often target in his purges, bringing him into conflict with the head of the army, Leon Trotsky, who saw Stalin as a dangerous political rival. Trotsky would express his grievances to Lenin, leading to Stalin's removal from Tsaritsyn and beginning a lifelong rivalry between the two men, a conflict from which only one of them would survive. In 1922, the same year the Soviet Union was formally established, Stalin would be elected to the position of General Secretary, a role he would use to secure his rise to power. The position allowed him to set the agenda for meetings of the Politburo and the Soviet government, as well as placing the careers of numerous Soviet officials in his hands, giving him a large and loyal following. But towards the end of 1922, a power vacuum would emerge at the highest levels of Soviet government when Lenin became seriously ill, suffering a number of strokes that impeded his ability to govern the country. But to Stalin's horror, Trotsky would manage to form an alliance with the dying Soviet leader, giving him a significant advantage in the power struggle. Stalin would respond by calling Lenin's wife and subjecting her to a torrent of abusive language. an event that would be so upsetting to Lenin that he would call for Stalin's removal from government. While Stalin managed to keep his position, a rift had opened between him and Lenin, the most influential and respected man in the country, putting his political career in a very dangerous position. But in 1924, Lenin would die, giving Stalin the opportunity to reshape their relationship in the eyes of the public. And so he would take control of the funeral, giving himself the politically significant role as one of Lenin's pallbearers. Lenin would be enshrined in Moscow's Red Square, with Stalin portrayed as the protector of his legacy in Soviet propaganda. Trotsky, his hated rival, was given the wrong date for the funeral, causing him to miss the event entirely. Over the next few years, Stalin would expertly manipulate events to secure his rise to power, pitting his rivals against each other and eventually amassing enough support to strip Trotsky of his position in government. With his main political opponent gone, there were few left to oppose Stalin. He would systematically demote, arrest and exile his political opponents, and by 1928, he would emerge as the sole leader of the country. Having secured absolute power, Stalin began transforming the Soviet Union into a modern superpower. In 1931 he would state, "We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it or we shall be crushed." He would begin a policy of rapid industrialization, launching a series of 5-year plans to grow Soviet industry. But the implementation of these plans would be chaos. Ignoring the advice of economic experts, Stalin would double and then triple production targets, nearly none of which would actually be met. Inflation was rampant, money was spent with no budget, and entire factories were constructed with only half-finished blueprints. But despite this, production did see a notable increase, securing the Soviet Union's place as a modern industrial nation. To support industry, a policy of forced collectivization was implemented, where peasants, the country's largest group of people, were stripped of their private property and forced to work for the state on collective farms. Anyone who refused was beaten, shot or sent to labor camps known as gulags, where they would be used for slave labor. But the policy would be met with extreme resistance, with many peasants preferring to burn their crops and slaughter their animals rather than let them be taken by the state. In some instances, Stalin's response was extreme, with villages that refused to comply being bombed out of existence by the Air Force. With the peasants lacking any economic incentive to work, agricultural production saw a massive decline, soon leading to a devastating famine. Reaching its peak in the winter of 1932 and 1933, the famine is estimated to have caused the death of up to 7 million people, with millions more being left permanently disabled. Parents would sell their children for food, with the countryside seeing widespread cases of disease, banditry and cannibalism. Anyone who kept stores of grain was accused of hoarding, and were beaten and tortured until they gave up their supplies. The famine would hit Ukraine the hardest, with 3.5 million people dying there alone. The Ukrainians would call the famine the Holodomor, a name that means murder through starvation. Stalin would only make things worse, exporting 2 million tons of food out of the Ukraine, and forbidding those that lived there to move away. Their only option was to wait and die, with thousands of starving people turning to cannibalism to survive. But for Stalin, the countryside had been brought under control. Although it had cost the lives of millions and had reduced the peasants to slaves of the state, it was a price he was willing to pay to feed the industrial workers. But as the 1930s went on, Stalin would become increasingly paranoid of those around him, constantly searching for traitors and conspiracies and looking for ways to secure his power. He would first target his political opposition with the assassination of Soviet politician Sergei Kirov, providing a pretext for convicting his most influential opponents of conspiracy. Between 1936 and 1938, a series of show trials would be held, where the accused would be convicted on fabricated evidence, tortured into giving a confession, and then shot. The old Bolsheviks were targeted, those who had been around since before the revolution and retained strong political opinions and influence. They would be replaced by young politicians who could be easily manipulated and were completely loyal to Stalin, knowing never to question his judgment. Army officers soon came into the firing line, as Stalin believed their power and influence had grown too strong. Many were convicted of working as agents for Trotsky, with over 35,000 officers being shot or imprisoned, and the Navy losing every single one of its admirals. But soon the purges would extend to every corner of Soviet society. Ordinary citizens were encouraged to report suspicious friends and family to the authorities, many of whom would do so out of fear of being targeted themselves. The secret police were also appointed a new leader, Nikolai Yezhov, who would set his officers' arrest and execution quotas, often purging his own staff to impress Stalin. At only 5 feet tall, he was soon nicknamed the Bloody Dwarf, true to his enthusiasm for torturing his victims. Between 1937 and 1938, an average of 1,500 people were killed every day, a period known as the Great Terror. Around 1.6 million people were arrested, 700,000 of which were executed, with an unknown number dying in labour camps and torture chambers. Stalin's paranoia had become extreme, with a colleague describing him as suspicious to the point of insanity. His purges would also have a devastating effect on Soviet society, with a culture of fear and distrust emerging. Those working in industry were afraid to suggest any changes or innovations that could get them accused of sabotage, leading to a slowdown in economic growth. The military were particularly affected, and would suffer from an extreme shortage of experienced commanders, with discipline and quality suffering as a result. And with war on the horizon, the purges could not have come at a worse time. As the Great Terror began to wind down, international relations were reaching a boiling point, with Europe soon erupting into World War II. Stalin would initially sign a non-aggression pact with Hitler, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which allowed him to invade and take over large parts of Eastern Europe once the conflict began. These territories would quickly find themselves subject to the same oppression experienced in the Soviet Union for decades. The most notorious example of this was the Katyn massacre of 1940, where almost 22,000 Polish prisoners were killed to prevent any ideological opposition from emerging. That same year, a Soviet agent would also manage to hunt down Stalin's longtime rival, Leon Trotsky, assassinating him with an ice pick in Mexico City. But soon, things would turn against Stalin, with Hitler breaking their non-aggression pact and launching a surprise invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. The Soviet army, completely unprepared and weakened by Stalin's purges, would suffer devastating losses, with Stalin himself entering a state of shock. Just a week after the invasion began, Stalin would disappear from the government and began hiding away in his Moscow home, with a terrified group of officials being forced to approach him to convince him to lead the war effort. But Stalin's military leadership would be filled with the same brutal tactics he had employed throughout his career. He would insist that every inch of ground be held, giving the death sentence to those who surrendered, leading to the pointless loss of thousands of men. Those deemed to be fearmongers or cowards were placed in special penalty battalions, who would be sent to their death at the start of battles, to help reduce enemy ammunition. Taking this further, he would make it illegal to be taken prisoner, with the families of prisoners and deserters being stripped of their government pensions and arrested. Terror was also used to maintain army discipline, and just 4 months after the outbreak of war, over 10,000 members of the army had been shot by their superiors, often directly in front of their comrades. But despite this brutality, the tide would soon turn, with a combination of Soviet heroism, Russian heavy industry and Western assistance pushing the Germans back. By 1944, Nazi Germany were in full retreat, with the Soviets claiming a large portion of Eastern Europe and eventually capturing Berlin itself. But it had come at the cost of 25 million lives, the highest death toll for any country in the Second World War. Victory in the war would greatly benefit Stalin's dictatorship, with Soviet propaganda portraying him as a hero. At home, his rule was unquestioned, and he now owned a vast empire that spanned over 2 continents. From his humble beginnings in Georgia, he had risen to be the leader of the second most powerful country on earth, surpassed only by the United States. With his new territory spanning from the Baltic to the Adriatic Sea, Stalin would assert his influence over Eastern Europe, with Churchill stating that an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent. The Cold War had begun, a conflict that would come to dominate the rest of the 20th century, with Stalin battling the West for control and ideological influence in Europe for the last years of his life. Joseph Stalin will go down as one of history's most notorious leaders. He can be credited with transforming the Soviet Union into a modern superpower and for leading the country through the Second World War, but it came at an immense cost. Between 1930 and 1952, over 26 million people had been shot, imprisoned, or subjected to internal exile, an average of over 1 million per year. Tens of millions more would be arrested without charge, evicted from their homes, or forced to work on dangerous projects, with it being estimated that at least 60 million people had been subjected to some form of repression during Stalin's rule. But despite this, many Soviet citizens would remain devoted to their leader. The state produced an endless stream of propaganda, portraying Stalin as a hero and a father figure. Paintings, songs, and statues were all commissioned by the dictator, with several towns and cities being named after him. Official history books would distort events beyond recognition, and he would go as far as to doctor historical photographs, removing his political rivals from important events in Soviet history. This propaganda would be incredibly effective, with many expressing genuine grief at his death and worrying about a future without his leadership. Even prisoners in the Gulag, many of whom Stalin had sent there himself, are known to have wept at the news of his passing. Hero or tyrant, a great modernizer or a ruthless killer, there can be no doubt that Stalin was one of the most influential figures of the 20th century, whose legacy has shaped the world as we know it today.